Good morning. I just woke up to a big game update called Project Rebalance Combat. 3 weeks ago, there was an update called Project Rebalanced Skilling, and this is like the other half of that. This is the combat version of that update. Jagex has been running betas of these changes and collecting community feedback for a while, and today a lot of these things went live in the main game. There is so much to go over, so let's jump right into the news post. Here we go. Project Rebalance Combat Changes, aka Evolution of Rebalance. No, I'm just kidding. Jagex is prefacing everything by really trying to make it very clear that this is not the evolution of combat that killed RuneScape 2. We want to reiterate that we love old school's combat system exactly as it is. They are not going to be adding action bars like they did in EOC. You'll see as we get into the news post, but it's more like rebalancing the defenses of monsters and changing what weapons are better where, and making it more so that weapons fit their niche and every weapon has a good use somewhere, rather than one or two weapons being good everywhere and other weapons not being good at all to use anywhere, and also to open up new space for rewards that won't contribute to bloat and power creep, so that way they'll be able to add more new weapons that can fit their own specific niches. It sounds a bit scary, but don't panic. Most changes won't impact the current gameplay at all. More so, you might have to make one or two adjustments to squeeze a little bit extra power out of your equipment. Jagex is really trying to be like, please read our news post and not just the title, by saying all this right at the start of the news post, but most people don't read the news post and just read headlines. But that's what I'm here for. I'm here to read the news post for you and show some of the stuff in game as well. So let's jump into it. NPC defense changes. This is the majority of the news post, changing around the defenses of the monsters. The NPC defense changes is split up into three parts. There's the mage defense, range defense, and melee defense. Which is kind of in order too of the biggest changes to the smallest changes. So mage has the biggest changes now, specifically elemental weaknesses. There's a list of monsters that now have weaknesses to either air, water, earth, or fire spells. This is kind of like a new stat that the monsters have, elemental weakness. Like for example, if we go to the wiki page for steel dragons, and we scroll down to their magic defense, you can see it has 50% weakness to earth. There's the formula. You have your magic damage percent, which is the magic damage of the gear that you're wearing, and you add that together with the elemental weakness percent, and that's the multiplier from your base damage. They're saying that the additive approach means that elemental spells receive bigger buffs for mid-tier setups and aren't as overpowered even if you have high magic damage percent gear. And the point of the elemental weaknesses is to give the standard spellbook more love, because right now people usually use powered staves like the Shadow or the Trident, and if they're not using that, they're probably using Ancients. And it's not like elemental weaknesses will make the powered staves or Ancients worse, it's just making the elemental spells better and allowing them to fit into a niche. If you use Monster Examine, it'll tell you if the monster has an elemental weakness and what percent it is, but you don't have to do that really, because there's this handy spreadsheet that they made that you can check out if you want to, but by this point, the wiki's already updated with all the monsters. When you look up a monster, it'll tell you what their percent weakness is and what it's weak to. And now let's check out the list of monsters. This doesn't say the percents, but it does have for each type. So for air, there's Barrows Brothers, Aviancies, including Kriara and the minions, ghosts, skeletons. It's interesting though. I'm excited to try out Wind Surge at Kriara. Water weaknesses, we have the chromatic dragons, not metal dragons, but the chromatic as in green, blue, red, black, and the baby in brutal versions too, and KBD. Water Surge to KBD will be interesting. Lava Dragons, as you'd expect, water, good against lava. Although the run to KBD is in the wildy, so you would be risking your stacks of runes. That's something to keep in mind. Don't want to risk too many Wrath runes. Then we have a variety of demons, including demonic gorillas. People don't really use mage. Well, maybe they use shadow now. I don't know. But maybe more people will be using mage because water spells are good against them. Greater demons, hellhounds, including Cerberus. That'll be interesting. Water Surge for Cerb. Kirill and his minions. Zami God Wars is weak to water. That'll be interesting. And lesser demons. And finally for water, there's Pyrofiends, Fire Giants, Giant Mole, and Drakes. Moving on to earth, there's not too much here. It's the metal dragons, bronze through a rune. All the metal dragons are included. Water fiends and worms, and then lastly, fire weaknesses. Giant spiders, and then almost anything that begins with ice in its name, including Ice Demon in Chambers. And of course, when they add the Ice Giant boss in 5 years, that's going to be very important too. Well, Ice Demon was already weak to fire. I don't know if there's like extra magic damage now compared to before or not. Then we have Moss Giants, Mountain Trolls, Scarab Swarms, Scarab Mages, Vespula, and the Abyssal Portal in Chambers, the Nightmare Totems, and it says keep in mind these do already take double damage from mage attacks, so if you're using fire, you're going to have some very high hit splats. Kefri and the Scarabs in the room, and Zora. I was looking at the weakness percents for all the bosses on the list, and they're all around 30 to 50%, except for Ice Demon. Ice Demon was 150%, but this is all around 30 to 50% weakness. Zora has a 50% fire weakness, and being one of my favorite bosses in the game, I had to try it out, doing mage only. Take a look at the bottom right of my inventory. When I crafted my 200,000 Wrath runes in August of 2022, everyone laughed at me and made fun of me, saying, why would you do that? You'll never go through that many, especially on an Iron Man. But now, the truth has been revealed. This whole time, I knew that 1 year and 9 months later, we would be getting elemental weaknesses as part of Project Rebalance Combat. Maybe next time I should use my crystal ball powers to predict the winning lottery numbers rather than an update in old school RuneScape. But anyways, I only did this one kill, which isn't much of a sample size, and probably wouldn't be too fair to try to extrapolate too much from this example. But if I had to compare it, it kind of felt like on par to doing the Bofa only method. I would assume that Shadow and T-Bow would be better, but this can fit a niche for some people depending on the stage of their account. Like for a mid-level Iron Man, Firewave could replace whatever they used before, like Trident or Curse Scepter or God spells. I was pleasantly surprised that I was able to hit through Zora's mage phase. I thought it'd be like trying to T-Bow the melee form, which very, very rarely hits. And while maging the mage form was noticeably less consistent than maging the other forms, it was a lot more accurate than how the T-Bow is on Zora's melee. Keep in mind, I am using close to best in slot gear, but it's all relative because by the time you have late game mage gear, then you're probably using it as an alternative to other best in slot gear. Or as a mid-level Iron, you'd be using the mid-level mage gear to replace other mid-level gear that you may or may not have. You know what I mean? It's all relative. And the whole goal of this update in the first place is to provide alternatives so that people have more options and to bring more life to items that didn't get much use before. I think this example with Zora perfectly shows that they're not trying to change the metas or create new overpowered methods. This is the kind of balance Jagex was looking for. There's a thing we haven't yet got into in the news post, but I'll just explain it now because you could see it in the clip. There used to be a 1-tick delay whenever you would first attack a monster with autocast, but with today's update, they got rid of that delay. You could bypass that by using the spell on the monster to start the autocast, but that wasn't really feasible for a lot of situations, especially for bossing that requires a lot of running around or eating, like in raids or God Wars or Zora, or really like most bosses in the game. Even for AFKing Slayer, that meant you would lose a tick for every monster you would attack, which could really add up, although standard spellbook spells weren't really even used for training Slayer anyways. But now with the elemental weaknesses added to a lot of monsters, a lot of Slayer tasks should be good to use standard spells on, and I think that removing the 1-tick delay was a great idea as part of the rebalance to make those spells really feel more worthwhile to use. They said that they purposely tried to keep a short list of monsters because they don't want it to feel like the whole game is changed overnight with every NPC getting weaknesses. They're waiting to let the dust settle to see how the changes impact the game before they make more changes. And they also say we're not going to be drip feeding them week by week. They're not just going to keep on adding a few each week. They're going to wait a bit, see how things go, and then potentially add another big chunk of NPCs later on, depending on how this goes. And nothing is set in stone either, like the percents of the monsters. They could be buffed or nerfed, depending on the feedback that they get from here. Moving on from the list of the elemental weaknesses and the explanation of elemental weaknesses, now we have elemental spell scaling. If you didn't already know, every spell has its own base max hit. Like for example, Wind Strike through Fire Strike, they each have their own max hits. Wind Strike is 2, Water's 4, Earth is 6, and Fire is 8. It wouldn't feel very fair if a monster was weak to wind spells because naturally wind is the weakest of the 4 elements. That's where this elemental spell scaling comes in. Your max hit with elemental spells will now scale to the highest spell you have unlocked. It's for that tier specifically, which means looking at the strike spells, if you have at least level 13 magic for Fire Strike, then all the types of spell of that tier of all the strike spells, these will now also all have a max hit of 8. If you only have Earth Strike unlocked, then all these spells are capped at 6 until you get 13 magic, then all these will be moved up to 8. I'm sure Jagex considered the idea that all the monsters that have a wind weakness could be the highest amount of percent, and then the ones with the fire weakness could be the lowest amount of percent, and they could scale it that way. But I feel like that would have been really arbitrary and may make it kind of weird trying to add more content in the future. I like what they decided on better, doing it this way. And they're making it clear that all the spells retain the max hit of their tier. So Fire Strike will only have an 8. Even if you have Fire Surge unlocked, it's not going to change the fact that the max hit of Fire Strike is 8. Now we're moving on from the mage defense, and we're moving on to range defense, starting off with range defense types. They've split up range defense for NPCs into 3 categories: light, standard, and heavy. These classifications are based on the type of ammunition. We've got heavy, which is bolts and javelins, aka crossbows and ballistas. Standard, which is arrows, that's short bows, long bows. It includes bofa and crystal bow, T-bow as well. And then light, which is darts, the blowpipe, or knives, or other thrown weaponry like thrown axes or the obby rings. Adding these classifications of the different types won't mean significant shifts in gameplay today, but for the future they'll be able to add specific range styles and make cool new rewards to match. They are preparing for the future of rebalancing, or no, they're rebalancing now to prepare for the future of balancing. And they give a couple random examples that may spark your imagination. Imagine an enchanted bow that fires light arrows, or a new type of ballista that's actually worth using, because right now the current ballistas are very slow. Most NPCs aren't seeing any adjustments to range weaknesses, whether it's to heavy, standard, or light, but there are still a few. This is the whole list right here. And everything on this list is actually pretty significant. Unlike with the mage elemental weaknesses, like half the list was random slayer mobs, but all of these are pretty notable. Starting off with dragons, they've had their heavy range defense reduced. Metal, chromatic, baby, brutal, KBD, and lava dragons. Zilyana's had her ranged heavy defense reduced, so crossbows will be even better. Corp, heavy defense reduced. Gargs, heavy defense reduced. Lizardmen, light defense reduced, so blowpipe will be better there. Next is interesting. Her heavy range defense has been reduced. Crossbows were already really good at Nex, so now crossbows will be even better to use. Voss is weaker to heavy range. Vespula is weaker to light range. The Abyssal Portal is weaker to heavy range. Skeletal Mystics weaker to heavy range. Basilisk Knights weaker to heavy range. Remember, again, heavy range is crossbow, so crossbows will be better for all the heavy ranged weaknesses. So Mystics, Basilisk Knights, crossbows will be better. Baba, crossbows will be better. Leviathan, crossbows will be better. I started thinking about leagues because, you know, traditionally crossbows are considered not that good of a weapon, mainly because they're a 5-tick weapon. But in the last league, all the 3, 4, and 5-tick weapons all became 2-tick weapons, and that kind of made crossbows the best option. Like, it was better than the short bows, it was better than the bofa even. And that just kind of reminded me of what they're sort of doing here. Like it says right here, short term these changes mostly improve the standing of crossbows in places they've fallen behind the bofa or T-bow. And that reminds me, I want to talk about the bow of Fertinen, aka the bofa. The bofa especially has become a really big problem in my opinion, at least for Iron Men. Kind of main accounts too, but they could do methods they enjoy to earn the GP to buy it, so maybe not so much for mains. And I understand that when you choose to play Iron Man, you lock yourself behind certain grinds, but a lot of grinds you could skip over and be fine. I'm mainly talking about melee here because there's so many melee options like the Fang, Whip, Bludgeon, Rapier, Hasta, Lance, Voidwaker, Blade of Saldor. You can pick and choose which one you want or which couple you want and be fine. Even if it's not the most efficient weapon for that boss or mob, it wouldn't be too much of a setback generally. But as an Iron, you need a bofa. Like if you ever want to get into PVM on your account, you need to get a bofa because the blowpipe and ACB will not cut it, and you'll be at a significant disadvantage if you don't get a bofa. And any PVM that requires range would really not be worth your time until you get it. It's kind of funny because there's a big deal about when the blowpipe was going to be nerfed, because how the bofa is now is how the blowpipe used to be. You would need to get a blowpipe because it was good for nearly everywhere in the game that you would use range. And on the day of the massive blowpipe nerf, they added the bofa into the game that same day, which basically replaced most of the places that the blowpipe had been good at. And while it did put the blowpipe into its own niche little corner for uses, it didn't really solve the problem of one weapon being good everywhere. So there's kind of two problems. One problem is an Iron Man problem, and the other is an everyone problem. The fact that the bofa is like 80 hours of skillful, intense PVM just to meet the drop rate is an Iron Man problem. But the everyone problem is the balancing of range weapons. I'm not saying the metas need to change, but just like with melee, I think it should be that if you don't have a bofa, the weapon that's good everywhere, the alternatives should maybe be like 80% as good as bofa instead of 50% as good, where it's a significant disadvantage to not have the main weapon. Those aren't exact percents, by the way, I'm just using those numbers to get the point across. This is the only part of the news post where Jagex acknowledges the balancing of the bofa, but I think it's a major part of the problem, and I want to emphasize how important this rebalancing is for range. Now that we've gone over the defense changes for the magic types and the defense changes for the types of range, the final one is a really small section for the defense changes of the different styles of melee. And in case all these different styles have been confusing so far, I'm going to explain something and hopefully it's going to click when I say this. With mage, there's 4 weaknesses: air, water, earth, fire. With range, there's 3 types: heavy, standard, light. And with melee, there's 3 types: stab, slash, and crush. And you can see this when you go to the wiki page for a monster. Take rune dragons, for example. When you scroll down a bit, you can see the melee defense, the mage defense, and the range defense, the different styles. And here's the list of monsters where they adjusted the melee defense of them. We have dragons, all kinds of dragons except for Vorkath have lower stab defense, including drakes and worms. Gargoyles have had their crush defense reduced and their stab and slash defense increased. I feel like before it didn't really matter. People kind of argued, oh, should you use bludgeon? Should you use rapier? Should you use fang? Like, it didn't really matter too much, but now with this change, it sounds like it should be significantly more to your advantage if you use a crush weapon, like a bludgeon. I wonder with the dragon mace or the cudgel, I wonder how that would be compared to, say, a whip. I wonder if those would be better now than a whip for gargoyles. Lizardmen, including brutes and shamans, have had their stab defense reduced, so if you really want to, you can stab the shamans. Vasa and Mystics and Chambers have had their crush defense reduced. Interesting. Basilisk Knights have had their crush defense reduced, and Duke has had his slash defense reduced. And that is it for the defense changes section of the news post. We've gone over the defense changes for mage, range, and melee. The next section now is item rebalances. Starting off, we have magic damage redistribution, and this means they have redistributed the magic damage across different pieces of gear. They reduced the magic damage from one item, and that allowed them to increase the magic damage on like all the other mage armor in the game. And the item that they decreased the mage damage from was the Occult Necklace. It went from 10% to 5%. There's places where you would just bring an Occult Necklace with a staff because it was that OP. Like at DKs, you easily get away with a Trident and Occult for Rex, or for God Wars, you could bring an Ancient Staff and Occult Necklace to heal on the minions between boss kills. Even after this change, I think it'll still be perfectly fine to do that. Your max hit will be 5% lower, but they didn't change the accuracy of anything, just strictly the damage. And for those of you that don't know, mage damage percent, the thing that specifically refers to is your max hit. That is what that increases and affects. We had one necklace item that gave 10% magic damage when full Ancestral, the best mage armor set in the game, in total gave 6% magic damage. The necklace is basically a guaranteed free drop for irons when they hit 93 Slayer, or for normal accounts, it is extremely cheap. It's almost always been under 1 mil. Compared to full Ancestral, which is currently 400 mil at the time of this update, and it only gave 6%. It felt like you could get the most mage damage early on, and as you progressed or got more GP, you would spend more and more time, or more and more GP, to get diminished mage damage from your armor. I mean, I'm not saying it's necessarily bad to be able to get high mage damage armor early on to help you get the later game mage gear, but 10% from one piece is pretty crazy. The Occult Necklace was added into the game April 2014, and I've been playing since day one in February 2013, but in my opinion, 2014 was the year OSRS could have died. The Occult Necklace was one of many last-ditch efforts to help players progress fast so they wouldn't be as inclined to quit as soon, as well as spice up PKing, which was one of the big things that kept people playing at the time. I can make a whole separate video about the early days of the game, but basically I think it was OP because they didn't want players to keep quitting. Bringing it back to the news post, the point I'm trying to make is explaining why Jagex did this, because by balancing the magic damage of all the different armors, I think this will make armor progression for both irons and normal accounts feel more fulfilling and rewarding as they advance through the game. Okay, let's get into the changes now. So like I said, Occult is going from 10% to 5%. That's the one thing that got decreased. Everything else is an increase. For each piece of Ancestral went from 2% to 3%, so it's 9% for the whole set. Virtus went from 1% to 2%, 6% for the full set. And then for the rest of these sets, this is for the helm, top, and bottom. Each piece had 0% before, now it's up to 1%. So all these sets for the three main pieces will now give 3% magic damage. This is a pretty big one. Augury, the magic prayer, went from 0% to 4% magic damage. Tunic and Shadow has a passive effect where it multiplies your accuracy and damage by 3x, or 4x even inside of TOA, but is clarifying that the passive effect does not work for prayers. So it is still a 4% and not a 12% damage boost with the Shadow. Even the lower level magic prayers got some love too. Mystic Might went from 0 to 2%, and Mystic Lore went from 0 to 1%. Eternal Boots, 0 to 1%. These are kind of controversial because a lot of people don't like having boot switches and don't want to depend on keeping up with the old DPS by having to now bring a boot switch. So we'll see if anything changes with that, because a lot of people seem to not be happy with it, but a lot of other people do seem to be happy with it, so you know how the game is, can't please everyone. And everyone is biased after all, even if it is subconsciously. People are biased for the things that generally tend to help themselves more, not just in reference to the Eternal Boots, but it's Kind of true for like any controversial item or gear changes in the game, rebalance changes in the game. Mage's Book now gives 2%, Ancient Wyvern Shield now gives 2%, Malediction Ward 2%, the Arcane Spirit Shield went from 0 to 3%. I can't believe they didn't make this change years ago. Arcane has been such a weird item for a long time. I'm glad to see they're doing something about it. Of course, they're doing this after the Fortified Ward has been in the game for a while, but better late than never, needs to be done. Seer's Ring and the Imbued Seer's Ring gives 0.5% magic damage, and then Full Elite Void had 2.5% damage, now it's 5% damage. And as all the changes, or the redistribution for magic damage, next we have other item adjustments. For the Soul Reaper Axe, stacks will no longer be lost instantly when you switch weapons. Stacks will start decrementing after 20 ticks without attacking, up from 10 ticks from before. And when the stacks naturally degrade, they'll heal you for the damage you took while building those stacks up, as long as you still have the axe on you. The Elder Maul is now like a better version of the Dragon Warhammer. They added a special attack to it. It costs 50% spec, just like with the Dragon Warhammer special attack. It hits with 25% increased accuracy compared to the Dragon Warhammer that has 50% decreased accuracy. Okay, I made that part up. The Warhammer does not have decreased accuracy, but it feels like it sometimes. And the Elder Maul reduces the target's defense by 35% on a successful hit, whereas the Dragon Warhammer is only 30%. If you add up the crush accuracy of the Dragon Warhammer and the Avernic, it's 95 and 28. So that's 123. Even the base accuracy of the Elder Maul is already more accurate, but then you have the 25% increase with the special attack. And speaking of the special attack, it says, most importantly, this looks really cool. I don't have an Elder Maul in game to test it out with, but it shows the new special attack right here, and it looks different depending on if you have a cape equipped or if you don't have a cape equipped. That's pretty similar though. Look at the price chart for the Elder Maul though. I mean, for the longest time, since like 2019, it's been hovering around 10 mil, up until they made the announcement in the last few weeks, or maybe a month or two ago, where they announced that the Elder Maul would most likely be getting this special attack, and it went from 10 mil before, under 10 mil, to now it's 170 mil? Is that accurate? 175 mil. When you use the Dragon Warhammer on Tecton, the first spec is always guaranteed to hit. But the Elder Maul, I've heard people say that the Elder Maul is not guaranteed to hit right now. I've seen people say both, that it does have that effect, and some other people say it doesn't have the effect, so I don't know which is true. But I would suspect, even if it's not working right now with the special attack, I would suspect Jagex would change that and also make the Elder Maul spec be guaranteed for the first hit on Tecton. So yeah, Dragon Warhammer now is not the best in slot anymore. The Elder Maul is the replacement for the best in slot. Yeah, it's like the same thing. It's a crush weapon that decreases defense of the enemy with its special. So it's literally just a straight up upgrade to the Dragon Warhammer. Not an upgrade, but a better version of the Warhammer. Wait, I just saw this post, so I'm coming back in here to show you. There is one way in which the Elder Maul is worse than the Dragon Warhammer, which is you cannot use it to build the chest in chambers. Like Aiza says, you're building a chest, not demolishing the walls. It's not a hammer, it's a maul. We'll see if they change that in the future. I mean, there's definitely a possibility that they might allow you to use it to build a chest, but right now you cannot. Moving on from those now, we have Inquisitor's armor set pieces. Now gives a 2.5% accuracy and damage when you use the mace with it. With the Ancient Godsword special attack, healing from a successful special attack now heals for 15% of the target's max HP, up to a cap of 25 HP, instead of before it was a solid 25 every time. The Tome of Fire and the Tome of Water now boost their respective elements by 10% against NPCs, down from 50% previously, except the Tome of Water was not 50% previously, it was 20% previously. But anyways, and then they still boost their damage by 50% and 20% respectively in PvP. And it's kind of funny they acknowledge in the second sentence that the Tome of Water is 20%, but they said in the first sentence it's 50%. But yeah, it doesn't matter. Of course, the reason why they did that, like I showed earlier in the video, they added all the elemental weaknesses. So it's to balance it out, because otherwise 50% extra damage with the Tome of Fire would be insanely OP. And with this change, the tomes are still the best in slot items for their niche if the enemy is weak to that element. That's the last of the other item adjustments. Next section, I think it's the last section I want to go, yeah. Last section of the news post, miscellaneous combat adjacent changes. Starting off very spicy here, the Dragon Warhammer now has a drop rate of 1 in 3k instead of 1 in 5k. This has been very controversial, and as I said, people tend to be biased towards what benefits them. People that went through the grind already or have more time to play the game are not going to be happy, at least compared to people that don't have a Warhammer or don't have as much time to play the game. They are going to be happy with it. Not everyone aligns that way, but I'd say say generally is the case. Some people see it as an Iron Man update specifically to cater to Iron Men, but at the same time, for the game as a whole, it's not the best in slot anymore, and therefore not as sought after. Power creep is bound to happen over time, and as stronger monsters get added to the game, older gear and weapons tend to be less relevant, which is also kind of the whole point of this rebalance, to make older gear more relevant and to prepare the current content that's in the game, prepare it for the future. Some people are worried that lowering the drop rate could set a precedent for other drop rates to be lowered in the future as well, just because Iron Men complain about it. But at the end of the day, with unpulled changes like this, Jagex will do what they think is best for the longevity of the game, and personally, I'm not worried. The minimum hit has been adjusted. So the way it worked before is that, say your max hit was 10, you have to pass the accuracy check first, and once you pass that, you would do between 0 and 10 damage, inclusive of 0 and 10. So you could get a successful hit, but still hit a 0. As of today's update, you no longer roll a 0. So if your max hit is 10, you're now going to roll between 1 and 10 rather than 0 and 10. But it's replacing the 0 with a 1. So it says right here, if your max hit is 3, you can roll 1, 1, 2, or 3. So it's not like it gets rid of the 0, it just replaces it with a 1. So now you have 2 chances to hit the 1, if that makes sense. This change affects 2 different things. The main thing that they were going for, I believe, with this is for low-level accounts. When someone makes a new account and they start fighting goblins, if your max hit is 1, first you have to pass the accuracy check, and once you pass the accuracy check, you would still have a 50% chance of hitting 0. And that should make the really early game feel better. The other group of people this affects is when you're using the Dragon Warhammer spec. It doesn't matter how much damage you do with the Warhammer, as long as you roll a successful hit, then the defense of the enemy is reduced, or I guess for the Elder Maul now too. And that meant that it was possible to hit a 0, but still have your enemy's defense be lowered because you passed the accuracy check and rolled a successful hit. I always thought it'd be cool if they added a red 0 hit splat. I always thought that's what they would do to solve the problem of not necessarily knowing if the Warhammer hit, but this works too. You can still hit 0 though by splashing, or if you fail the accuracy check. Still on the topic of splashing, they added a new item called the Cursed Amulet of Magic, which is a 1 in 5 drop rate from the Necromancer South Ashazian. It gives negative 80% magic damage. And looking at the wiki page for it, you can see right here, there's negative 80% damage and then minus 3 mage accuracy. I checked the collection log and this is not on it. There's no slot for the Cursed Amulet of Magic. They reduced the prayer drain for these prayers. These are the first 5 prayers in the prayer book. It was 5 prayer points per minute. Now it's 1.67 prayer points per minute for each prayer, which is 1/3 of the drain that it used to be. Sharp Eye and Burst of Strength now boost your range and strength by 1 level, respectively, if those levels are lower than 20. And just for reference, Sharp Eye is level 8 prayer, Burst of Strength is level 4 prayer. So if you're playing a low level account and you're trying to be efficient and you want to try to get the +1 extra max hit sometimes maybe, then you could flick those prayers. Or I guess you don't have to flick them now necessarily because they decrease the drain by quite a lot. Basically, it's making those prayers actually useful because I don't think anyone really used those really low level prayers. They're doing some rebalancing, just like the title of the news post would imply. This is what I was talking about earlier in the video. There's no longer the 1-tick delay when you attack with autocast. And now you can figure out what you're going to do with all that extra time you have. I'm going to spend my extra time complaining to the JMods on Twitter. The dreaded monkey room in TOA has been changed. You will now always do your max hit on the monkeys if you use the proper opposing combat style against them. But they have adjusted the HP, they've increased the HP to make up for it. Each type of monkey has a weak and strong variant, and this is their HP respectively for each of them. So they're all going to be between 20 to 35 HP. And these will not scale with the raid level or group size, but I think with a bigger group you'll get more of them. I think that's how it should work still. This will also apply to the other NPCs not listed, the Volatiles, Cursed Baboons, and the Shamans. But you won't be guaranteed max hits against those. When you pray melee, Baba still hits through your prayer. She used to do 33% damage, but now it's only 25% damage. So if you mess up the red X or you just don't red X in general, it'll be a little bit more chill at Baba. They've increased drop rates from Fasani's Nightmare and regular Nightmare. You can see all the drop rates listed here if you're curious about that, but it's the Inquisitor's Armor, Orbs, Mace, and Nightmare Staff. They're all better drop rates now. And the final thing on the list is that Ava's devices will now apply their ammo saving effects to javelins as they do for other ammo types. I had no idea it didn't work for javelins, and that is everything from the Project Rebalance Combat version of the Project Rebalance. I do want to remind you that nothing is set in stone. Things can change. They probably hotfix things already, and they probably will hotfix more things throughout the week. They're taking the community's feedback into consideration, and I would not be surprised at all if with the next game update they do even more stuff with Project Rebalance. I'm sure it won't be as big as this week's update, but I wouldn't be surprised if we have some more bullet points that were similar to this week's bullet points in next week, but just less of them. And yeah, we'll see what happens in the next game update. We'll see if there's any more big changes. I really like making these types of videos because trying to simplify things to explain them to other people, I found it helps me figure out things for myself, and it solidifies that knowledge in my brain. And of course, I do really hope this was able to help you out too. I know a lot of people have some strong opinions that they're going to share in the comments, and all I'm going to say is just remember that everyone wants what's best for the game. We all just have different ideas of what that is. With that said, thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.